I've got a very short space of time to talk about a very large topic. And so I obviously can't do it justice in these 15 minutes. So I'm just going to touch on a few pertinent issues that are coming up specifically during COVID-19, because grief and bereavement are obviously topics that are very large just on their own. And I'm sure most of you already have a good working knowledge of how to understand grief and bereavement and how to help people who are going through this incredibly difficult time. So one of the factors that I want to focus on today for the purposes of this webinar is how natural protective mechanisms are now insufficient to help people going through the grieving process. And one of those natural mechanisms is people's cultural frameworks and their cultural backgrounds. And what do I mean by this? I mean that when people experience death in their families, one of the things that kicks in automatically is culture. All of us belong to some sort of culture. It doesn't mean that we have to be particularly religious or spiritual, but it means that we are all embedded in some sort of cultural framework that tends to know what to do when someone passes away. For example, if you're part of the Islamic faith, you know that things have to get done very quickly because a funeral has to happen within 24 hours. If you're a Hindu, you know that your grieving process goes up to a year. And in fact, for the first 13 or 16 days, it's intense family time, rituals, singing of prayer songs, family gatherings. And the mourning period goes on for 3 months, 6 months, and eventually 1 year. If you're Christian, you know that there's often a church service. If you are Jewish, there's something called the sitting Shiva. If you're Buddhist, there are other particular types of rituals that take place. If you, from an African traditional background, you know that funerals are often big events and sometimes even celebrations. You know that people don't even need an invitation to attend. They tend to happen on weekends. Part of it is even celebratory. And so depending on the culture that you come from, your culture knows exactly what to do and it knows how to do it. During COVID-19, unfortunately, those things cannot take place in the way that they used to, which means that the natural protection we have from developing serious psychopathology due to grief and loss suddenly cannot take place anymore. And every culture, like I said, has their own customs and their own rituals for dealing with how we mourn our loved ones. But every culture shares one common element, and that common element is social connection. No matter what culture you're from, no matter what belief system you have, no matter what religion you follow, no matter what your spiritual inclination, social connection is at the heart of helping people grieve during the loss of a loved one. And unfortunately, because of physical distancing during COVID-19, that social connection is now very difficult, because part of social connection is physical comfort. One of the times as human beings that we need to feel another person's body on us, we need to have that skin-to-skin contact, is during the grieving process. We naturally hold someone's hand. We naturally wipe someone's tears. We naturally hug someone and hold them tight. And that physical connection is so important for us as human beings to process emotions during a grieving process. And so the grieving process is now disrupted. We've got to do it in a way that's actually unnatural to us as human beings, but also unnatural to the kinds of cultures that we come from. So it can feel especially isolating and difficult at a time when you need that the most. People feel sadness during a grieving process, but now they're also going to feel helpless, they're going to feel anger, and they're going to feel frustration. One of the reasons anger and frustration are going to be common feelings is because beside dealing with the loss of the loved one, they're also dealing with the loss of familiar cultural processes. Because one of the things that makes grief bearable is that when your culture kicks in automatically, there's a certain soothing comfort that takes place knowing that certain things are taken care of. For example, in many cultures, the grieving family doesn't have to worry about cooking. Other people might even move in with them for a short period of time and take care of daily chores and cook food and ensure that they're taken care of. But this is probably impossible now during COVID-19. During a funeral is one time that you tend to see relatives and friends and people that you haven't seen in a very long time, because it's expected that no matter what your differences, no matter how long you haven't seen people, funerals are times when people come together, they put their differences aside. It decreases the distance between loved ones who haven't seen each other in a long time. Old feuds are forgotten. But now, because funerals are limited to 50 people or less, and many people are opting to have even smaller funerals only with absolutely immediate family, many people are not getting that opportunity. Many people are losing out on the chance to have those social relationships mended, because grief is a time that brings people together. And so there's anger, there's frustration, and there's helplessness. And so one of the possibilities is that people have to surrender their sacred cultural practices to the pandemic. So you're making a sacrifice. You are losing your loved ones, but you're also sacrificing the rituals that you would have normally used to provide you comfort. So in fact, what's happening now during COVID-19 is that there is a double loss. There's the loss of the person who died, and also the loss of your culture, the loss of your familiar rituals and processes, which means we have to help people process these complex emotions which they ordinarily might not have felt with this intensity before that. One of the consequences of this is that we might see far more psychopathology when it comes to grief and bereavement. And although we know that grief can eventually lead to depression if people cannot tolerate the loss of the loved one, in general, human beings mourn and then are able to integrate that loss into their life and carry on living a healthy, functional life. But we do know that some grief can become complex. And when that happens, we tend to call that either complicated bereavement, or, to use the language of the DSM or the ICD, prolonged grief disorder, or persistent complex bereavement disorder. And those of you who haven't heard those terms before, prolonged grief disorder is basically grief that endures beyond the normal functioning, and interferes with the person's life and lasts for at least 6 to 12 months. The DSM says 12 months, but the new ICD-11 criteria says 6 months. And it creates a sense of disbelief where you can't accept that the person has died, and you're unable to accept the loss, even though a significant period of time has passed, and even though it's not culturally appropriate anymore to be mourning. And this inability to continue with your healthy life can often lead to you feeling continuously intense feelings, or even on the extreme end, feeling quite emotionally numb. And research shows that this increases the risk of substance abuse, sleep disorders, and even impairs your immune functioning, which we know is not a good thing during a global pandemic, because a lowered immunity means that you are at higher risk of contracting the virus. And at its most extreme end, this might eventually lead to depression and even suicidal thinking, especially if people have been very dependent on the person for whom they've lost. Research shows that this prolonged grief disorder before COVID-19 happened in about 1 in 10 people. But with COVID-19, chances are that this might increase even more. There's a lot of research on this area, so I do suggest that if you suspect people are suffering from this prolonged grief disorder, or that their bereavement is reaching a stage where it's actually culturally inappropriate and is interfering with their occupation and social functioning, that you do some background research to discover how you can help people. And I also said that I want to talk a little bit about culture, because although I've been talking about culture in quite general terms, I think it's important to understand that as South Africans especially, we are a very religious and a very cultural society. That based on our last Stats SA General Household Survey, it showed that the majority of South Africans belong to some sort of religion, either Christian, Muslim, African traditional religions, Hindu, Jewish, Buddhist, or other kind of more marginal minority religions. And so depending which religious belief you have, there is a particular way in which your background deals with grief and bereavement. And I'm sure no matter what background you come from, those social connections are going to be disrupted during this time. So the reason I'm emphasizing this is because this speaks to how we intervene then in mental health interventions. It means that we've got to find ways to help people connect socially. because that'll be the way in which we help them deal with the loss. And this is going to be quite difficult because as a psychologist, and especially as someone that is a big fan of support groups, that would be my go-to solution at a time like this. People who are struggling with grief, my suggestion would be that you enroll them into a support group specifically for grief. But we know that even our regular mental health interventions are now almost impossible to take place because of physical distancing and because of safety measures to prevent the spread of the novel coronavirus, which means even something like a support group, which would be a fantastic mental health intervention, cannot happen now in the ways that it used to happen before. Or if it does happen, the venues have to allow for significant social distancing. Everybody will have to wear a mask on. People will have to sanitize before and after they enter. And the numbers of people that are in that support group will have to be limited. But if you can run a support group, that would be probably one of the most ideal interventions for people who are suffering from grief and bereavement at this time. If you cannot run a physical support group, then one of the options might be to do this electronically, maybe in a similar way in which we're having this training right now. But one of the difficulties with electronic interventions is that not everybody has equal access to the internet, to computers, to smartphones, to reliable Wi-Fi. And we know that data can be quite costly. And so running an online support group, although it might be one solution to physical distancing, does not suit everybody, especially people who might be struggling in outlying areas who even before COVID-19 did not have equal access to mental health care services. So we're going to have to think of very creative ways in which we intervene with people. But the principle behind our interventions will have to be around social connection. We've got to find ways to get people to connect with each other. We've got to find ways for people to get the kind of social support that they would have received had their culture not been disrupted because of physical distancing. And we've got to create a space where people can express their feelings in a way that's respectful and where they're not being judged and where it's confidential. And so as a counselor or as a therapist or as a psychologist, or even as a health professional trying to do some mental health intervention, some of the therapeutic considerations that you've got to have is, number one, remembering that you are dealing with a double mourning, a double loss, the loss of the loved one and the loss of familiar cultural comforts, familiar cultural context. Secondly, that you are going to help the person reconstruct the grieving process, because whatever grieving process they went through, it was missing the cultural elements that would have normally helped them make sense of this experience. But because they didn't have that, they might then be feeling a sense that there isn't proper closure because they didn't do things that they've been raised to believe are the correct things to do when someone passes away, which can be quite difficult. So there might be this kind of existential or spiritual angst, a feeling of incompleteness, a feeling that something is missing, maybe even guilt that they're going to do something wrong, maybe even guilt that if they're Hindu, bad karma might come to them. If you believe in ancestors, that the ancestors might be angry. That if you believe in heaven or hell, that you might have even done something that doesn't allow the good departure of that soul. Whatever it is, whatever beliefs people have, it's important that you work with those beliefs. And during these kinds of mental health interventions, we allow open discussion of topics like religion, of spirituality, of cultural beliefs. If we don't allow these conversations, there's going to be a resistance to therapy. There's going to be resistance that the counseling space or the mental health space is not actually catering for the problems and the concerns that I actually have. And if we allow these conversations to happen, we will then also prevent the medicalization of grief. And by the medicalization of grief, I mean that we don't instantly think that the way people are responding is pathological. Because even though I spoke about the possible increase in prolonged grief disorder, our first step shouldn't be to assume that the person has a disorder. Our first step should be to assume that the person's natural ways of healing, their natural ways of boosting resilience has been disrupted. And so we need to, in some way, we have to be a substitute for the culture that would have taken place instead of us. We are a poor substitute for culture, but unfortunately, we might be the only substitute that people have during this time. And so it's important to help them process feelings of guilt, of shame, of anger, of sadness, etc. There's many other things I can say about grief and about bereavement, But I think the important principles have been outlined. And I think it's important that you work from the point at which the person is, that you deal with their immediate concerns, that you are not quick to pathologize their experiences, that you actually help them contain a situation that might feel very uncontainable and might be very difficult for them to make sense of, because all of us are figuring this out as we're going along. It's difficult to know how to deal with situations we've never had to confront before. Many of us, for the first time, are having to scratch our heads and wonder, how do you have funerals with physical distancing? Many of us have no idea what to do when we see the bereaved family, whether we are allowed to hug them or shake their hands or just look at them. What do we do in their physical presence? These are all questions that are new to all of us. We're all figuring it out as we go along. And you're one of the people that would be invited to be part of the journey of people who are struggling with these issues.
Hi, Alison. Thanks so much for coming today.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Thanks. And I think this is really going to benefit a lot of people, especially your experience that you've had with counseling people with regards to grief. And especially this time now with this huge pandemic that we're all coping with, which is totally out of our control. Yes. And it's put us into a situation where we can do nothing about it. It's there, you know. And we've had a lot of grief, a lot of people dying, and we've called our webinar Complicated Grief and COVID-19. So my first question to you is, you know, people that go to hospital and maybe are not, do not come out because of COVID, and then the relatives and their loved ones cannot go and see them. And this is a huge problem. So, you know, things that you cannot say to your loved ones who are dying during this pandemic, like, I forgive you, I love you, you are not alone, you can let go now, we will be okay, and you will be okay. How does one deal with this type of complicated grief?
I think these are very real questions and thoughts that people have at any time. You know, the situation now is we don't have a time to prepare. COVID seems to strike so quickly, and then people are rushed from home into hospitals. And I've known of people to go from Durban, Richards Bay, trying to get to Pietermaritzburg. So yes, these become very real thoughts. And I think it does provide for an unsatisfactory closure. It's very hard. It's not a case of you know how to cope with us. None of us have really been through something like this before. And what makes it more complicated is that you don't really have time to dwell on those thoughts because you're still dealing with trauma and the COVID itself. So when people lack the time, I think possibly one of the ways they could deal is writing letters. You know, what would you have said? And writing is a therapy. And if they can maybe write letters, I have read messages on Facebook for people who have lost a loved one. And when you see that expression of pain and grief, that is part of the healing as well, that you're getting it out there. Talking to people, trying to share those feelings with others just helps you overcome. And a lot of these are perhaps rhetorical type questions. What would you have said if you had if you were able to see them?
Yes.
But I think it's trauma upon trauma because they have contracted COVID and then you've lost them without having the ability to communicate. And that becomes a double trauma. And this is what people are dealing with now. Impacted trauma, and it's trauma upon trauma. I don't know that particularly answers your question. You know, I think because...
Carry on, sorry, carry on.
I just think it is such a complicated one because access is restricted. And I don't think it's only for people with COVID. There are people, I know of somebody who was admitted into hospital for non-COVID related events and sent for a photograph of her children. And the next day she passed on because she couldn't see her family. And that to me was a tragedy as well. That was definitely a non-COVID event. So even these people, when they know that their family members are ill, but still can't visit the patient in hospital, they also restricted. And you don't have time for those last minute or maybe a phone call if they are able to communicate. That's,
and I think one of
it's a
the most
very traumatic.
Traumatic thing is especially with the elderly who are maybe in hospital, as you say, maybe not even COVID related, and they have a short memory span or they don't understand why their daughter or their son or their grandchildren cannot be there, and they cannot understand why suddenly they've just been left alone in this terrible situation. And that is really heartbreaking because it's difficult for them to understand because they don't remember. You might tell them now and then like an hour later they've forgotten and it becomes such a traumatic experience for them and heartbreaking for the family.
It is. There's a lot of issues that are now coming to the fore as side effects from COVID. We talk about the depressions and things like that, the loneliness of people. And it's not only the old people, it's middle-aged as well, but the fear of going out, the anxiety of going out, and then being in isolation, and there's no stimulation for some people. So it's a very big thing. And I think if we can help anybody, as you're doing with this this interview, that hopefully we can reach out to people and assist them, because it's difficult to find help at a time like this.
Absolutely. And that goes to my next question, which grief is not just about dying. It is also about coping with all types of loss. And this, especially during this pandemic, what do you say to that? What would you suggest? Because there's a whole lot of things. It's the spectrum.
Yes, it's like touching the tip of the iceberg. Loss, grief, we experience the stages of grief for any form of loss, but we really associate loss when we're talking about losing a loved one, after a death, after an illness or an accident. But in actual fact, loss, we're dealing with loss of a job, loss of finances, loss of friendships, loss of lifestyle, companionship, all those in the natural period, what we call the normal life we knew, those were losses that can cause the 5 stages of grief. Now it's compounded because with the COVID-19, we have people who have lost jobs, which means they have lost finances. So it's the change of lifestyle. You can't afford the lifestyle that you had. You can't socialize because of social distancing. So all these things have compounded. And we just think of COVID-19, but there is a whole host of other losses that people experience as a result of COVID-19. And there again, trauma upon trauma. They are feeling this mounting burden. And then you've got fear built into it as well. How am I going to cope without a job? How am I going to fend for my family? I've just lost my spouse. How do I pick up the pieces? If a husband or father is gone, that could be the breadwinner. How does mother or the wife pick up from there when you're afraid to go out? How do I deal with my children? And what do I say to them? And I think these are very difficult times with mounted trauma. It really is a whole complex issue altogether.
It is huge. And the only thing I know or I would suggest is that you can only just take little steps at a time. You can't put
it's one day at a time.
Exactly. You've got to work on certain things and work on those. Otherwise it's just going to be too huge for you to cope with. And then one of the other questions, which is carry on, sorry.
No, carry on, you go on.
No, I had another question with related to that. Is, people feel isolated.
Ask the question.
Yeah, and then they feel isolated, and they don't think they will ever get over the death of the spouse, the child, the sister. So what do you suggest? Because it's even worse now than a normal situation. There's isolation now.
Yes, hopefully they are able to have communication with some people, because a natural therapy is talking. If we are able to talk about that person, if we are able to have memories, so you can find or keep in contact with people who have known it's a mutual friendship or relationship where you can talk about it, that begins a healing program. It's a process of talking until the pain reduces. It's painful in the beginning. The more you talk about it, the less emotion that you feel. You are now beginning a journey of recovery. So talking is vital. And ironically, it's the most difficult if you've got social distancing. But hopefully this is where the phone call at least, but we can meet in coffee shops, we can get together with individuals, and this is what we need to do. And I think for us who are able to handle the conversations and the support structure, if we can be available to these people as well, because it's not a case of having to solve their problem. We can't. We can't begin to understand what that person is going through, but we can be empathetic. That's what we need to do. And just listening to somebody talk. You have to remember, we don't have to fill every gap. We don't have to answer every question, but let them reflect, have their memories, and let them grieve and just be there. Just be there.
Absolutely, yes. And that takes me to another question, which is avoidance. Many people avoid talking about loss and the loved one who has died. And that makes a person feel even more lonely. And especially now with the pandemic, where a lot of people have actually faced loss of some kind, it becomes even more difficult. And so people will say, well, my friends are not supporting me. What can I do? What do you suggest?
Well, I think at the best of times, we don't deal with death very comfortably. We do, even prior to COVID-19, we would avoid people who have experienced a loss. And that's simply because we don't know what to say. And it's rather than go and put ourselves in that awkward position where we feel, well, maybe I'll upset them, maybe they'll break down in front of me and I don't know what to do. They avoid it. And I don't think it's any different now than what it was then. And if we can just be there for the people and just help them, that they need to get through these lonely times, we need to talk about the people. Absolutely. We need to let them talk. They need to talk. They need to get things out. And if they're thinking about, why don't my friends support me? Maybe you haven't asked. That's another thing. What can they do? We can't expect people to know what we want. So maybe reach out and just say, come and have coffee. I may not talk, but just come and have coffee with me. Or as a friend, if you can just reach out, actions are sometimes what is needed, where if you know somebody's lost, just go and be there to make tea. So if people pop in or there's formalities that have to be addressed, just be there in the background as a backup support. And we just need to support one another. I don't think people deliberately hold back from support. It's more, I don't know how to deal with it. But one of the things that did cross my mind with this question was also that fear. And that, what if it were me? How would I deal with it? And I have had a sense that people who have been infected with COVID, there's a stigma attached. And people have this fear, well, if I go there, am I going to be infected? So keep my distance. So I think this is a mentality that we have to change as well, that we do need to reach out to one another. If we're not going to be there for one another and support, we are as a society just falling apart as well.
Exactly.
So we do, I think, as friends, we reach out.
Exactly. It's like a stigma that is associated to COVID. Yes. You know, like we've got for suicide. We seem to get these
even with HIV and AIDS.
HIV and AIDS, yeah. Yes. So it's that stigma that we have.
You know, that stigma, if I'm in your company, it's going to jump across. If we are adhering to the formalities of mask wearing, distancing, and washing hands and things like that, you know, the people who have followed the rules to the T have been infected. So there is no guarantee. You just try the best you can. You try the best you can.
Yes. Thanks for that. And then the other question I had is, you know, some people go to therapists and they seem to help in the beginning, but then it feels like nothing's happening and they feel let down. What do you say to that? Should they quit the therapy? Is it, or are they expecting too much?
Sometimes expect the people to solve our problems, but a therapist is not there to solve your problems or give you answers. A therapist is there to reflect, be a sounding board, rephrase, and let you speak out your concerns and pose those questions that make you think. Because ultimately, we want to empower the person who is seeking the help. So if they are seeking answers from a therapist, they are not empowering themselves. They are not going out strengthened. So they need to be in full understanding of the role of the therapist. You can't go in and expect to come out and say, okay, she told me to do X, Y, Z. It's not like going to a doctor and getting the medication. You get a script, off you go. You are in the process of healing by talking through and listening to yourself and rethinking, because they will pose situations. Have you considered this? What if this were to happen? How would you handle it? So it's reflected back. And sometimes we don't want to be in that position, but I think we do need to look at what the expectation is before they go in. A therapist is not there to solve your problems. Otherwise, as you go forward, every time a challenge comes, it's, well, who do I turn to now? But you want to know, I have got the strength, I can overcome. And going forward, yes, there will be challenges, but look how strong I am. I have got this far. I can do this. We want that hope. That's what we've got to build into people.
Thank you. And my last question is support groups. Can they be of help? And especially now with pandemic, can we do this online, on WhatsApp groups? And what other resources are there?
Yeah, I do. I think a support group is a fantastic idea. And if it needs to be online, then that's the way to go. The strength of support groups like SADAG is you are dealing with like-minded people who have been through a similar situation, and they can identify with you. They can give you not always the answer, but they can say, well, I dealt with that situation by doing this. And somebody else can offer a different suggestion. So you're getting the support, you're hearing from people who have been there, which in itself means, you know what, look where they are. They've got through this. I can do it too. There is hope for me. So a support group is good because you're putting together people who have had a similar experience. And that's the best type of person to help you recover. You know, as therapists, from your last question, some haven't been through some of the experiences you go through. So they're talking academically. They've got the theory, they are out reaching out, but they don't always fully empathize with the situation that you are in. So I do feel the support groups, I know of a person who went through a very traumatic tragedy a few years ago, and she has turned into a grief counselor and turned something that was negative into something positive. So when it comes to reaching out for help, I'm available. I know Geraldine would be available if we could refer people to her, and we can reach out and make a difference, just as you and SADAG, we are out there for people and will reach them in whatever form, because sometimes it could even be distance. You're not just looking at your own neighborhood here. We are talking nationwide. So we have to be available and use whatever form of counseling support, technology, contact. I think if we can do human contact, or as it is get together physically, it is the best. There's no doubt about it. But in times like these, technology plays a part.
Thank you, Alison. That has really benefited me, and I'm sure it will benefit our listeners. Thank you so much.
With pleasure.
Thank you.
With pleasure.
Hi, everybody. My name is Nthabise Motsa, and I'm the author of this book, The Entangled Heart, and Set Yourself Free from Generational Emotional Pain and Setback. And today, I am invited by KZN to come and speak about or share about my journey on from cancer. She did not tell us about it. She had hidden it from us as the children and the whole family, simply because moms do that. I think she was protecting us, and she didn't see the other side of it, that when she passed on, it was traumatic and shocking, because she did chemo, so she had her hair, she had everything that we knew her to have. We knew that she was not well. We didn't know how bad it was. So this grief, and if I should say, my mom was the only parent I have. She was a single mom. So when I went to see her, I was also securing a job. And so I went home for a little while and I came back. When I came back, she passed on. And unfortunately, I had to go immediately. I had not even spent 2 weeks in this job, so they had to lay me off from that job. As you can see now, it's piled pain. I left my mom only for her to pass on, and I came this side to actually secure the job that I eventually lost after I had left her. And this is the reason why I am talking to you today, because the grief was just piled up. It was too painful. It was embedded with a lot of shame. It was embedded with a lot of guilt. And these are the things that I want to discuss with people who are going through the pain of grief right now, because those soul enemies that I call them soul enemies in chapter 4 of The Entangled Heart. Those soul enemies are the ones that actually put me in a place where it took longer for me to heal. It took longer for me to even start the mourning process or the grief process, because I felt like I am such a bad child. I thought I was such a horrible child. How could I leave my mom? And I also thought like I'm a bit stupid. How could you leave your mom on your deathbed only to lose the job? And I was so self-hating and so hard on myself. So I want to talk to you about the 5 things that helped me to get out of there. And the process of writing this book also helped me a lot. And me sharing to you and being vulnerable helped a lot, especially in the writing of the book. So the first thing that I want to say or tell the people, if it was the first time you lose somebody you love, this is the first thing. If you are a person who have never experienced death or grief of this depth, it will be so hard on you. My mom was the first person in the family to pass on from my side. Everybody else who have passed on, they were older. I didn't even know her mom. So she was the first person. And it gets to be shocking when you experience that time. It's more terrifying, and you would want to figure it all out by yourself. And group, which is one of the things that I'm going to talk about today, you need one. So the second thing that I would advise you to get is some support group, people that will support you, friends, people that you constantly speak with without shame or doubting yourself or justifying your pain. Those are the amazing people that we need when we're going through grief, especially the sudden death where you did not expect at all. It leaves you shocked. It left me hopeless and desperate for answers. Now I was guilty. I was ashamed. I just felt like a better option. I wasn't suicidal and my life did not make sense. I didn't have the job. I lost my mother. I hated and blamed everybody. I blamed myself until I realized that I practice grace on myself and start my mourning process. The third thing that I warn you about, beware of guilt, okay? I call it a soul enemy because that's what it is. It almost destroyed me. I felt like my mom was a single mom. She worked so hard for me. How could I be so selfish? How could I leave her alone? Like the only thing that I was feeling sorry for her. And in that moment, I felt like she felt that I wasn't there for her. Like I did not give myself time to actually feel the pain of my mother passing. I was feeling sorry for her. And somebody came to me and said, your mom would never appreciate you. Somebody who did not even tell you that they were sick, they would never appreciate you hurting yourself in this manner. And it gave me a little bit of a wake-up call, but it didn't heal me immediately. I had to come back to my senses to say, can you start mourning the pain that you feel inside so that you process this pain? So the fourth thing is shame, the shame around death and how it happened. And I've been talking to people during this COVID times. Most of the people feel like they are the ones who infected their parents when they pass on. And this shame and this guilt, they go together. That's why they are like a double trouble. You don't want to entertain them for too long because they will mess your life up and they will hurt you and you hurt your soul and you will feel helpless and hopeless. And in that time, you are just prolonging the healing process that you have to be embarking on. And the last thing that I want to tell people about is do not put a timeline on your pain. And this is a very important one because even when we have the support groups, there will be people who are actually crying over and longer than the other. This does not make them weaker than everybody else. This is just the way they process things. So I believe that everybody have a unique way of dealing with the pain. The most important part is for you to embark on that journey of healing and recognizing that your pain is real. That's another thing that I want to talk about. It's so real, and when you feel it, you need to acknowledge it in that moment. And when you do, I journal, I write, because sometimes when you speak, you feel like you are a burden at one point. So I journal a lot, and it has helped me in a long term, not just with the grief, to unpack and allow to see myself in the mirror of my writings. And this has helped me to process this horrible, very traumatic death of my mom. And daily, I live with the knowledge that she is no longer sick. And daily, I realize that it was her time. It takes time for you to feel good again. And I'm glad that I'm at that place where I am alive. I am enjoying my life. I am hopeful. I am loving my life. I am beginning to dream again. Above all else, I know that death is a process. So is birth. It's the ending of life. And it's something that now I live with. But for somebody who has just experienced it, it's understandable to feel the horrible pain, but do not settle in that space, and do not allow the guilt, do not allow the shame. Embark on the process and acknowledge the feelings that you have. Find the support group. Find the people that will listen to you without judging you, without feeling like you are overwhelming. Write those feelings down and start your healing process. Life is worth more. And I know that the people that we love that have passed on would only want or wish that we are good, even though they are no longer around. So I'm encouraging you, and I'm hoping that within the grief support groups that we are going to be doing, these are the things that we'll be talking about, and we will unpack some more and heal together. This is a time where we cannot be saying that we can be strong alone. We need to lean on each other and feel the strength of each other until we can be able to stand alone. And so thank you so much for this time to Sedek, and thank you for listening, and I hope it has given you some courage, it has given you warmth, and you feel that you are not alone in this pain. And yes, it will pass. The pain will begin to be better, and you will feel like yourself again. Thank you.